Cloud development is expensive, slow, and risky when you're testing directly on AWS. LocalStack has already crossed 350 million Docker pulls by letting developers run a full AWS emulator locally. And today we have with us Waldemar Hummer, co-founder and CTO at LocalStack. Waldemar, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
It's my pleasure to host you here. Before we deep dive into this whole 350 million and the capability you are bringing to developers, let's talk about the company a bit. Talk about the company. What do you do? What problem you're trying to solve for the whole ecosystem? Where you're founded, when you're founded. So it's a history and a story.
It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm CTO and co-founder of LocalStack. So we've been around as an open source project for quite a long time. Actually, it started in 2017 when we put out the first version of LocalStack. And that has kind of grown over the years. And in 2021, we got our seed funding and built the company. We're incorporated in Switzerland, but have US investors on board, and our team is globally distributed. So what we do as a product is we provide this local cloud development environment. It gives you the ability to test your applications and build them fully on your local machine, on your laptop, giving you much quicker feedback cycles and reducing some of the friction and burden that you usually have when testing against the real cloud. So that's our main value proposition.
When we look at KubeCon or the whole Kubernetes system now, the things are slowly moving towards Agentic AI, but this is still a kind of exciting space. And one of the things associated with Kubernetes is complexity, And I mean, we have it's not that this complexity is going to go away. I mean, now it's mature, it's production, so we all know this is not going to go away. We have to learn how to deal with it. So can you talk about how does LocalStack make cloud software development easier and faster and more efficient for developers, so they don't look at it like, oh no, versus, oh, let's do something exciting?
The basic premise is that when you develop against the cloud, first of all, it's this like highly scalable system that has all security baked in, and it's cost efficient, cost effective. But the developer experience is often subpar, not ideal, not optimal. Right. So what we do with LocalStack is we, instead of having to push every change to the cloud and wait for several minutes to deploy, we give you the ability to have a much more snappy experience on the local machine. So you're talking not about minutes or even hours sometimes to deploy, but it's more like seconds, that the feedback cycle. So you can think of it as your developer maybe has some IDE in front of them, and they make some changes to their code, be it a Lambda function or some kind of containerized application. And the moment they make a change in that application, it automatically reflects locally, and they don't need to go through any cycles of deployment. This problem is even more aggravated by some regulated industries where, let's say, you're in a bank or an insurance company, where sometimes developers don't even have access to the cloud. So they might need to push changes through some CI/CD pipeline that takes, let's say, half an hour to deploy. So the feedback cycles become even slower and even more tedious. And that's exactly what we're addressing with the solution. Now, when you brought up Agentic, the whole world of software is changing. We see a lot more agents these days doing the development. It's very powerful tools, of course. At the same time, this even increases the necessity to test and validate code very quickly, because you cannot always trust the code that's being generated by these agents. You need a way to test this in an efficient and also sandboxed manner without risking an agent pushing changes to the real cloud environment. That's where our AI sandbox use case comes in. So LocalStack as an agentic cloud AI sandbox that runs on your local machines.
Excellent. So you're already pivoting in that direction.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, you also mentioned regulated industries. Nowadays, of course, we are in Europe. Geopolitical crisis is going on, wars are going on. But there has been a growing movement towards sovereign cloud, sovereign AI.
Yeah.
How does LocalStack kind of also enable that capability, especially not only just high, I think it doesn't really matter these days whether you're regulated or not regulated.
Yeah.
You do want, and Europe is also building its own cloud, the alternatives to a lot of US-based solutions. So how do you feel that you are positioned in the right place, right time to also address this problem that we did not even envision?
Exactly. Yeah, we have a lot of conversations actually at KubeCon here about sovereign cloud, and it's a trend that's coming up. So I think in general, we're seeing a bit more trend towards decentralization, right? So maybe going away from this ultra centralized model of the clouds. And Europe is kind of very much on the forefront here. So with our solution, we give you the ability to run your workloads literally, on your machine, on your laptop. So I think this very much in our favor here. At the same time, we also, as a platform, we're going actually multi-cloud. So we've been focusing on AWS as the primary flagship product. But more recently, we put out a Snowflake emulator, which is the second product we've launched about a year ago. And we're also now venturing into Azure as the next cloud provider. So what we're looking to establish is a multi-cloud platform that allows you to test end-to-end your applications. And then also, of course, from a sovereignty perspective, also like diving into some of these sovereign clouds that are coming up now. It's a very exciting development for us actually from that perspective.
You mentioned, of course, we talked about AWS, Azure, Google Cloud is there, but Europe is also kind of building its own cloud.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you look at these hyperscalers? Is it like as a competitor, as something that you complement, or something as Europe is working? I mean, it's hard to build hyperscaler, and sometimes doesn't mean. I mean, there are a lot of efforts going on in Europe as well to build their own.
Yeah.
So, what is your sentiment about that? How do you look at these hyperscalers?
Yeah, great question. So we are, especially more recently, we've been starting to partner up very closely with AWS. We partner up with their product teams. We have sometimes co-launches, like same-day launches. Last year at AWS reInvent, we launched some features with the AWS Lambda team, for example, because there's a lot of pull from their customer base to enable a local developer environment. Last year, we also pushed out a feature for Visual Studio Code integration. So the AWS toolkit for this Visual Studio Code now has a native integration for LocalStack. So I think at this point, we're much more closely partnering up with the cloud providers. And I would anticipate or hope that this would also happen with some of the sovereign or European cloud initiatives that are coming up. Again, on the AWS side, we've been very successful there and hope to replicate that also on the Azure side and other clouds.
Now, since you enable developers to work locally, and how much open source do you consume, or how much open source do you support? How much your toes are in the open source world?
Yeah, so we definitely have a strong DNA in the open source. So we contribute part of our internal platform to open source projects. We also contribute a lot to upstream projects. So I think in the company DNA, it's pretty strong because the world really runs on open source. At the same time, I think now with some of the agentic changes happening, I think open source in general is going through an interesting shift right now as we speak. But we still see it as like one of the cornerstones of giving to the community and also accepting contributions from that perspective.
The reason I asked that question was that also in the Europe CRA is there. We have a deadline in December this year. Mm-hmm. Is there any impact on you folks because of CRA? Because you work in regulated industry and suddenly CRA puts a lot of onus on folks like you who are distributing, or enabling that. How do you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, generally we always work with our enterprise customers to see what works from a security perspective. What kind of regulations we need to abide by. I think open source has, of course, like the licensing piece of it, but then there's also things like security and security scans. So I think in general we're offering an end-to-end package that makes sure that our solution fits seamlessly into the enterprise environment, and our whole platform that we're building is also optimized for that. So yeah, I would say we're definitely very much sort of even more strengthening our enterprise footprint in that direction. You
folks have good adoption, good traction recently. Mm-hmm. Talk a bit about what is driving it.
Yeah, so I think one of the driving forces, and by the way, we just recently hit I think 400 million Docker pulls. I think something 65,000 GitHub stars. So some really impressive numbers. I think a lot of it is the love from the community that we get. Right, people really love the fact that they can use this tool very easily on the local machines and their laptops. So in general, like this bottom-up motion of adoption has helped us tremendously make the product really widely known, widely adopted. And now we're increasingly also, targeting the enterprise and buyer personas, but we're very much deeply rooted in the developer community with our product.
How closely do you folks work with your customer client? It's more or less like turnkey solution. You come, sign up, pay, and you're done. Mm-hmm. Or you actually work closely with them, their teams. What I'm trying to understand is that today, what is some of the pain points that developers face, despite all this maturity of whether it's we look at the whole cloud native ecosystem or Agentic AI ecosystem. What are some of the pain points that you see they're facing it, and that's where LocalStack is helping them?
Yeah, great point. So I would say there's two motions. One is our self-serve motion, where people can just literally, download the software and just get started easily. We call it a digital twin of the cloud, right? So you just run your container, and all your application, also things like infrastructure as code, maybe if you have something like Terraform, you just point it to LocalStack and it just works out of the box automatically. Then there's also a motion where we work a bit more closely with enterprises and, for example, talk to platform engineering teams. We often have strong success when we work with platform engineering teams who are building the developer experience for the organization more broadly. And those are typically our main sparring partners to introduce LocalStack as a main value driver across the broader organization. And then we can also play to the strengths of the solution. We can adjust it, tailor it to the respective environments. So it's very much there is a turnkey aspect to it, but we also do a lot of customizations with the enterprise that we work with.
Can you talk about what does your product portfolio look like? Is there a community edition? Is there an enterprise edition? Mm-hmm. Talk about that.
The main, everything built on top of our cloud emulators. So the emulators currently are AWS and Snowflake, and we're pushing out Azure in the next couple of months. And the emulators really provide the baseline for local execution of testing and development. On top of the emulators, we're building what we call developer experience features, DevX features. So we have one feature, for example, that we call App Inspector. It allows you to do deep inspection of your serverless application. You can get insights around what is the topology of my app. You can look at the events. You can look at event payloads and so on, and really give you much more deep capabilities for debugging and development. Another feature we recently put out is what we call chaos engineering. Chaos engineering allows you to inject errors or latencies into the APIs to test your applications for resiliency, right? So what happens if US East 1 goes down, right? What happens if my database is at capacity? And we can simulate these situations in LocalStack and make sure that your application is resilient to these kind of faults. Because things do happen in the cloud, right? So it's not happening very frequently, but just a couple of months ago, US East 1 was going down, and it's good to be prepared for these kind of error scenarios beforehand.
So if developers or enterprises look at LocalStack, what are they looking at? Because it's like the whole local whatever development is going back to local development once again. So how should they look at you? And if you can point out some of your competitors and what edge you have over those competitors?
I'll start with maybe the key value proposition. It's really basically three pillars. It's efficiency, cost savings, and quality. Efficiency, just from the feedback loop and just time savings, like many hours spent in a developer week. So that's the key pillar. The second one is around cost savings, because I think there's some estimates that a third, 30% of all cloud resources are just wasted and not really being used. Somebody forgets to shut down a cluster over the weekend, something like that. And the third pillar is around quality, because you shift left your testing, and therefore you just by tendency increase the quality of the application. So those are the three main pillars of our value proposition. When it comes to the competitive landscape, it's interesting, there's not that many direct competitors out there right now that are doing exactly what we're doing in terms of the local cloud development experience. But there's a few tools in the observability space, for example, like serverless observability, giving you insights into your application. Or there's another set of platforms, for example, serverless stack, SST is one of them, that give you a so-called remote experience. So you have the local look and feel, but it actually executes your workloads in the remote environment. But what we do is pretty unique, because we give you this fully localized environment that you can take with you in your CI/CD pipelines, in your local machine, or anywhere we kind of run these workloads.
And also reading that you folks also have community edition, but you're merging into kind of enterprise or single image. Can you talk about what is your strategy there?
That's right. So we recently made a change in our community offering to combine the images into one. We want to provide a more unified developer experience and user experience, because we saw that there was a bit of a fragmentation between the OSS version and our advanced offerings. The main change from a user perspective is that we ask for sign up. So previously you just downloaded the image, and nowadays you also ask just to create, give us your email address, sign up for an account, and then you can leverage the full power of the LocalStack cloud platform also that we offer with our web application, with some of these DevX features that I mentioned before. So that's kind of the direction we're going into now. And that allows us to also interact a bit more directly with our customers, with our users, and also optimize the product experience over time much more directly.
If I ask you in general, you have been in space for long, company maybe 40-year-old, but you have been in space for long. When you look at whole local cloud development, when you look at the emergence of Agentic AI, when you look at because of geopolitical crisis, more sovereign cloud, sovereign AI. Where do you think we are heading? What does the future look like for developers?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting observation. So first of all, there's a certain tendency towards, like, again, decentralization. It's kind of the pendulum is swinging a bit back and forth. If you look at the early days, in the 70s, 80s, it was mainframe, and then the web came about, which was decentralization. Cloud is another centralization. And now I think we see another wave starting of more decentralization, pushing things more to the edge and to end devices. I think the other acceleration we see is, of course, with agentic AI, right? So I think the world that we see today, if you look at 1, 2, 3 years into the future, it's going to look probably quite different from how we develop software today. So code is being generated much more quickly. So the pace of acceleration is actually quite remarkable with some of these models that are out there, which again means, a lot of people are talking about AI slop and code that's being generated that's maybe not trustworthy, which is even more critical to have strong quality gates, make sure that we test very diligently all the code that's being generated. And I think this will have a big influence on software engineering as a whole in the next couple of years.
It's interesting when we hear the word slop a lot, but we have been covering this industry for so long. When the Docker came, a lot of criticism was again containers. Oh, containers were always part of the Linux kernel. There's nothing new happening. Then OpenStack came, and then Kubernetes came. So we have seen that thing. But do you also think that the sloppiness is just a phase as technologies are mature? Of course, Anthropic's, MCP has changed. They have moved a lot of control to users.
Yeah.
So do you think this is just a phase, things will get better? Or you feel that, look at EVs, right? When the EVs came, they were like,
right,
you cannot barely go 50 miles. Now you can go 400 miles. You have this, a sports car with EVs.
Yeah.
So what are you seeing based on your own experience in the space?
Yeah. So first of all, I think any model that we see is the worst version of a model that we see for now and into the future, right? So models are just going to get better from here onwards, right? I think that's a general trend we can say. So if we're already quite excited to see and impressed to see Cloud Code and some of the other models, then it's only going to get better from here, right? So that's one observation. The second one is that we need to fundamentally rethink the way how software is being built, because a lot of processes have been built around humans. The code review, even like things like open source, feature planning, prioritization, right? All of these basic principles of engineering and product development are now kind of overnight, almost like they need to shift and adapt to this new reality, which means we need to be much more diligent, again, on being able to trust the code that's being generated by agents, have very strict quality gates, and make sure that we have a very tightly knit testing and quality assurance loop. So in my view, this is maybe one of the biggest driver of change in the industry. And again, it speaks very much into our storyline of, test frequently, test early, quality assurance is important. And with that comes a certain efficiency that you want to give to these models, right? They want to have a sandbox that they can, test against. And I know the whole industry is talking about sandboxes these days, and I think LocalStack is the ultimate sandbox, if you will, right? The cloud sandbox that runs on the LocalStack engine.
One thing I come from fiction and writing background or filmmaking background is that if I ask even my junior assistant or writer to write the whole story, that story is going to be disaster. So we always, write one scene, one chapter. With the AI also, when I do something, instead of telling it to do the whole code, it's like in chunks and stages. Then you can also review easily, then you can control. So I think the sloppiness comes in when you ask a junior developer to build the whole architecture. To
burn the ocean, basically, to boil the ocean.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%. So I think there's this incremental progress in making sure that you have guardrails at every step along the way. A lot of people talk about these days about spec-driven development, for example, right? So it becomes much more a matter of specifying exactly what you want, maybe in human language, and then the model has less wiggle room to do things wrong, right? So you need to be very diligent in terms of asking the what, and then how it's going to be figured out by the agent, basically.
This may be totally bad analogy. I cook a lot, Indian food. If you walk into me, hey, make me something spicy. I have no idea. I'll make something you won't even tolerate, So you have to tell me, hey, I want something chicken. I want this. Just give me ingredients.
Yeah.
So that's, because I am biased because I'm a heavy user of AI. I have built my own servers and stuff like that. So I do know its limitation, its power. And that's where the sloppiness doesn't come from the AI. It's come from just the way we had the whole DevOps, DevSecOps. I think same thing is it has to become part of the process.
Yeah.
You cannot just expect it to, as you say, fill the ocean like that.
And spicy might mean something very different to you than to me, for example, right?
Exactly.
So I think being very precise about expressing exactly what you need and want is going to be a superpower in the future, I think.
Right.
Yes.
The reason I asked these questions was that sometimes right tools bring the right cultural change. Sometimes right tools, like for example, if you're driving shift versus automatic, your driving style also dictates. So sometimes tools like LocalStack, they bring that cultural change because they force developers to work in that way. So can you talk about how is LocalStack actually becoming a catalyst to force users to actually, instead of looking at best practices as checkmark or compliance as checkmark, it becomes part of their practice and process so that the sloppiness is removed because your tool itself?
That is a great question. And so I think the first part is that what we see often if we introduce a tool like LocalStack, it results in kind of a cultural shift, how people think about, again, testing early in the process. Also how to architect your application to make, have testable units, for example, microservices with clear boundaries towards like the other services, and make sure that, you have units that are easily testable with that local sandbox. That's the first part. The second part is that now with a tool like LocalStack, you can do, let's say you want to validate or verify your infrastructure as code configuration, right? So previous approaches were looking at, maybe this is your Terraform script and it did some validation based on what is defined in the script. If you had some misconfigurations or something in there, but it can be hard to spot the exact misconfiguration in there, right? So you need some static code analysis tools or something like that. And with LocalStack, you can just say, I'm deploying my infrastructure against the container, against the sandbox, and then I run some runtime checks, whether is there any ports that have been opened that shouldn't be there? Are there any security holes in my deployment? So it's becoming much more of a trial and error situation where you can then verify your deployments in the sandbox as opposed to just doing static analysis. So I think those are some changes that we see. It also, from a collaboration point of view, we have a feature that we call Cloud Pods. It's basically taking a persistent snapshot of your container, and you can easily share that with your team members. So what that allows you to do is almost the equivalent of taking a full snapshot of an AWS account and then moving that somewhere else, which of course would be difficult to achieve in the real cloud, but you can do this easily with LocalStack, which makes things much more reproducible. If you have a failing test in your CI pipeline, for example, you can just persist the state, pull down the snapshot and reproduce everything locally so you have the full insights and debuggability. So I think, to your point, it just enables fundamentally new ways of working that are just not easily possible with the real cloud environment. And it also forces you to think a bit about how to adjust our dev environment in the best possible way to optimize for these quality outcomes.
If I asked you to give me an elevator pitch, if a developer or a C-level executive listening to you, why should they try LocalStack?
I think probably one of the best elevator pitches on my t-shirt here says, imagine the cloud running on your laptop. And that is literally what we do. So it's kind of really reimagining the sort of the location constraints that you currently have with the cloud, and you just basically give your environment wherever you are. But I think the more speaking to developer position, it's the three main pillars that I mentioned: efficiency, quality enhancement, and cost savings. Those are really, I think, points that resonate with most decision makers in the world out there, because it's all about quick time to market, but also making sure in this AI slop world that you have high quality and you're actually developing something that has long-term value and quality in that sense.
In this ecosystem, I feel, and I may be wrong, I think partnership and collaboration, they are the real thing. Nobody can go alone.
Yeah.
So can you also talk about the importance of partnerships for LocalStack, and who do you work with closely?
Great question. So we work a lot more recently with the cloud providers, directly the hyperscalers. AWS, for example, sees that there is a strong push from their own customer base to have local cloud development. We're also more and more partnering with, for example, Docker, which is a company that is based on containerization and very much also lives and breathes reproducibility and local containerization. So work a lot with Docker. And more recently, we're also starting to partner up with Agentic AI platforms. So we're starting some conversations to really embed LocalStack more deeply as an AI sandbox in some of these agentic coding platforms, to make it a seamless experience for folks to whenever you have some use case to develop your cloud app, You can just come to some of these agentic workloads or platforms and then have the environment almost transparently available for you, right? Not even having to think about that there's LocalStack running in the background, but just using it from the get-go. So we're looking to create like an ecosystem of players and providers that are also plugging into the LocalStack platform. We have a mechanism that's called extensions, LocalStack extensions. It's basically, you can think of it as a plugging mechanism to plug yourself also into LocalStack, and we're building that out more and more as we go.
Waldemar, thank you so much for joining me and of course share your insights on the whole local development, how to also enable developers, as you rightly said, running cloud in your local machine with AI, Agentic AI as well. So thanks for all those great insights, and the work you folks are doing in this space is also which is driving the industry. So I'd love to have you folks back on the show, but I really appreciate it, Andre. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great chatting with you. Thanks so much.